So yes, welcome everybody. Welcome to the Yorkshire Fossil Festival, which is running at the moment in person in Scarborough in Yorkshire and also online. And clearly you're online, so you're not seeing what's going on outside at the festival at the moment, but we'll be finishing at 4 o'clock. And we're very lucky to have a great talk to end our online program and essentially the full program. So I'll just mention a couple of things generally, that the talk is being recorded, and if you have any questions, please post them in the chat. We should flag that the Yorkshire Fossil Festival is supported by the Palaeontological Association and Yorkshire Coast BID and the Geologists Associations. We get support from all of those organisations to make the festival happen, and we hope to happen every year from now on if we can. So yes, it's my great pleasure to welcome virtually to Yorkshire, I know she has been physically to Yorkshire, Dr Elsa Panciroli of Oxford University Museum of Natural History. So Elsa is a paleontologist specialising in the ecology and evolution of mammals, particularly early mammals. And Elsa has recently written a book, Beasts Before Us, which is a key part of, I guess, what she will talk about today, telling the untold story of mammal evolution. Elsa has worked in all manner of fabulous places looking for early mammals, and she'll tell us all about that. There is a little bit of a link to Yorkshire in places as well, but we'll kind of come back to that and let Elsa tell you more. So yes, without further ado, Dr Elsa Panciroli will give us the final lecture of the Yorkshire Fossil Festival on beasts before and after us. So welcome, Elsa.
Thank you so much for that introduction, and welcome everyone. It's an absolute pleasure to be virtually at the Yorkshire Fossil Festival. As Liam just said, I am Elsa Panciroli, and I'm going to talk to you today about the beasts before and after us, and what sort of lessons we can learn about mammal evolution for the future. Before we go on, I should point out that a lot of the beautiful line illustrations that you're going to see throughout this talk were done by April Neander, who also illustrated my book. So yeah, you'll get to see some of those beautiful artworks. Okay, well, a little bit about who I am first. Liam already gave a really lovely introduction there. You know, basically, I'm a paleontologist, originally from Scotland. I'm currently a researcher at the Oxford University Museum of Natural History, and I'm an associate researcher at National Museums Scotland. Now, the Museum of Natural History in Oxford has an incredible collection for its relatively modest size. Of course, that's partly due to its history. And among the 7 million objects that we house are the only surviving soft tissues of the extinct dodo, and also the first dinosaur fossil ever described by Western scientists, and that's Megalosaurus. But we also have an extensive collection of mammal fossils from the time of dinosaurs. And this includes the first Jurassic mammal ever identified. Now, I study extinct life in general, but I specialize in the evolution of mammals, as Liam said there. And much of my work is on Jurassic mammals from the Isle of Skye in Scotland, which come from the same time period as the collections of Jurassic mammals housed in Oxford, which is one of the reasons why I'm based there. Now, most of these mammals are extremely small, and the fossils themselves are tiny. Things like this single tooth, which you can see here in a fragment of jaw that I'm clutching carefully between my fingernail and my finger there. Now, I use ultra high resolution CT and synchrotron X-rays to scan these fossils and study them. And that gets around the problem of their small size and lets me reconstruct them in exceptional detail to study them. So that's a little bit about who I am. Now, I think before we go on, it's worth reminding ourselves exactly what a mammal is. And I'm sure most of you know this, and you can probably all name the sort of main traits that unite the mammals that live on our planet today. So most mammals today give birth to live young. Some of them give birth in a pouch, into a pouch. So that, of course, is the marsupial mammals. Then there are the ones that give birth also to live young, but much more mature and with no pouch stage. And that's us, we're the placental mammals. And then there's just a few members of a third major group that still lays eggs. We all once laid eggs as mammals, but now only the monotremes do, and that's the echidnas and the platypuses. So the other things, of course, that we do is we all give milk to our young. We all have, well, I say we all have fur. Some have more fur than others. And of course, whales and dolphins only retain a few tiny hairs that fall out when they're very, very young. We also all have warmer blood, although how warm-blooded we are as mammals varies from group to group. So, of course, on top of this, there are these sort of characteristics of their skeletons and DNA and so on. But essentially, when I'm talking about mammals, this is the modern group that I'm talking about. But what I want to talk to you about today is my new book, or the story that's in my new book. And the book is Beasts Before Us, and it's a popular science book about the origin and evolution of mammals. Here are some of the really wonderful photos that people have shared with me when they've been reading the book. I love getting these. It's so funny, people reading them outside in their houses with their cats. It's fantastic. So thank you to everyone who sent me a picture. Today, I want to share with all of you for the Yorkshire Fossil Festival, the story of Beasts Before Us. And it's a tale that I think that, well, some of you might think you know parts of it, but I'm willing to bet that you've never been told the whole story before. Because I'm going to tell you the real origin story. I'm going to tell you about what that also tells us about the future of mammal life on our planet. And the story ends here. That's right. This is where the story of the evolution of mammals, at least the story that I'm going to tell you in the book, ends. 66 million years ago. At the end of a time period called the Cretaceous, there was an asteroid passing through our solar system, and it was pulled inwards by those irresistible forces that govern our universe. And it could have hit anywhere, but as luck would have it, it smashed into the Earth, into what is now Mexico. And the result, of course, as you all know, is catastrophic for the non-bird dinosaurs, as well as for many other groups, including marine and flying reptiles, and also the mammals that shared their world. And I think for most people, and in most of the books that you would pick up about mammal evolution, this is just where the story begins. But that's not the tale that I'm going to tell you. I'm going to tell you the prequel. I'm going to take you back to the real beginning of mammals, which can be found over 250 million years before this point. Before there were dinosaurs, before there were mammals as we know them, before there were flowers or pine trees or even beetles. The real story starts here. This is a time period called the Carboniferous. And at this time, the world was tropical. The air would have been hot and moist, and the amount of oxygen in the air was steadily rising until it reached the highest that's ever been seen in the history of life on Earth. Most of the planet was covered in these damp swamp forests, and on the forest floor, there were the first four-limbed animals, which had appeared on land. Now, they had evolved from lobe-finned fish, and later on, some of them began to lay eggs that had the tough shell, and that helped protect their young from drying out, because of course now they weren't living in the water anymore. So these are called tetrapods. These are the early tetrapods. And right back at the beginning, around 320 million years ago, the early egg-laying tetrapods split into two groups. Now, they were called the synapsids and the diapsids. Now, you can think of them a bit like Hogwarts houses. It's basically Gryffindor and Slytherin. These are the two great houses to which mammals and reptiles belong. So these tetrapods in the Carboniferous, they are the ancestors of all the mammals and reptiles that are on Earth today. But at this point in time, over 300 million years ago, they weren't mammals or reptiles. They were something else. They were from before they existed. And if you had gone back in time and taken a look around, all of these tetrapods back in the Carboniferous, they all looked kind of alike. It would been very difficult to tell the difference between them. But for a trained paleontologist studying their fossil bones, there are these tiny details in the way that their skulls and other parts of their skeletons are arranged that tell us that the mammal line in particular, Synapsida, had clearly broken away from the others. So the most important thing to take away from this is that mammals did not evolve from reptiles, as you might have been told in the past. But mammals and reptiles did share a common ancestor, which was a tetrapod back in the Carboniferous over 300 million years ago. Now, soon those mammal ancestors grew to become the largest backboned animals living on the planet. And one of the most famous, who I'm sure many of you have encountered before, is Dimitrodon, who you might recognize here. This was a giant carnivore that could grow up to 3 meters from nose to tail tip. And it had an enormous sail in its back, which was probably used to make it look a lot bigger and to frighten off other Dimitrodon and other animals. Now, although this animal, Dimitrodon, and its kin, they look a lot like reptiles to us, they are in fact mammal ancestors. And soon the world was filled with giant mammal relatives. So in the next time period, called the Permian, which was over 252 million years ago, these animals grew enormous. They were larger than today's cows or buffalo, which are included here to give you a sense of scale. They developed the ability to live on plants as food. And that doesn't sound like much, but it's actually quite a difficult trick to evolve because plants are very hard to digest. But these mammal ancestors, they became some of the first mega herbivores. And of course, where you have mega herbivores, well, carnivores tend to follow. So we also get the first saber-toothed carnivores like Gorgonops appeared. It was bigger than a tiger, had long canine teeth, could run very fast and pounce on its prey. And as well as this, we also had some smaller early mammal relatives that were evolving to start to clamber in amongst the trees and dig tunnels. Now, most of these, I should point out, of course, the cat is just there for scale. Cats evolved much later. Now, most of these animals back in the Permian, they were probably hairless. Some of them might have had maybe whiskers, maybe a few hairs here and there. It's hard to know. We don't have the fossil evidence yet. And we think that some of them were also slightly more warm-blooded as well and quite active animals. So all of these, they were flourishing in these early ecosystems of the Earth. And this is well over 50 to 100 million years before the first dinosaurs even appeared. But then disaster struck. So in what is now Siberia in Russia, volcanoes started to erupt just over 252 million years ago. Now this is like nothing you've seen on Earth today, because there was multiple volcanoes and they erupted for hundreds of thousands of years. And they poured out over 3 million cubic tons of lava. It's thought that this lava would have covered about 7 million square kilometers beneath a blanket of rock. So as you can imagine, this was destructive enough on its own. It smothered and killed everything it touched. But what was much, much worse was the amount of ash and gas that was erupted along with the lava. An ash layer would have spread around the globe. And this cut out the sunlight and killed plant life and starved the plant eaters, which of course in turn starved the animals that fed on them. But even those animals that made it through this global darkening had a much worse problem that they had to contend with. And that's that volcanoes, of course, release greenhouse gases like sulfur and carbon dioxide. And we know only too well, thanks to our human-induced current climate crisis, what happens when greenhouse gases are released too quickly into the atmosphere. So the sulfur, first of all, it bound with the water in the atmosphere and it created acid rain. And this basically burnt life on land. And it ran into the rivers and oceans and it turned them acidic, killing ocean marine life. And meanwhile, the carbon dioxide, well, the levels of carbon dioxide rose to the highest that have ever been seen in the history of life on Earth. And this gas, it trapped heat and it caused global temperatures to rise until the waters of the equator, if you were to dip your foot in the equator, in the Permian, in the water of the sea, it was as hot as an evening bubble bath. So about 40 degrees Celsius, and that's the ocean water. So the consequence of all this, of these volcanic eruptions and these greenhouse gases, is that at the end of the Permian, there was the largest mass extinction of all time. It wiped out about 3/4 of all life on our planet, on the land and in the sea. And with so much of the planet wiped clean, the clock was restarted again, the evolutionary clock, for those that survived. So many of those mammal ancestors that we met just a moment ago that had flourished up to this point and been, in every habitat and every ecosystem and doing everything you can imagine in the environment, well, they were gone. But a few did survive, like these animals. This is Lystrasaurus that you can see there in the foreground. Now, for a few million years, Lystrasaurus, which is one of these creatures it has tusks and a beak, very strange looking creature, it was actually one of the most common backboned animals on Earth. But it wasn't to last. Animals like this are known as disaster taxa. These are creatures that do really, really well immediately in the aftermath of an extinction event or a disaster, but they don't do well in the long term. So this new time period that they were in, which we call the Triassic, it was not the mammals or the mammal relatives that did well at first. It was the reptiles that were fastest off the mark. So, of course, as you all know, those reptiles evolved into the ancestors of crocodiles, as well as the ancestors of birds, the dinosaurs, and pterosaurs, marine reptiles, and actually lots of other reptile groups began to flourish at this time period. And they were really the most common creatures on Earth for the next 170 million years or so. But our mammal ancestors didn't disappear. Far from it. The dinosaurs are famous, especially for being enormous. And sometimes I think we tend to think that being gigantic means that you are somehow more successful. But being successful in terms of evolution doesn't necessarily mean that you have to be big. In fact, arguably, being small is actually the best way to survive. And we're going to come back to that later in the talk. So the mammals at the time of dinosaurs, they excelled at being small. So the dinosaurs, they swelled to become much larger, but the mammals shrank. They became these tiny midnight ninjas. They ate mostly insects at first, and they tended to come out at night. In fact, we know this because the majority of mammals today are still more active during the hours of darkness, and their eyes have adjusted in certain ways to make them especially good to see at night. So their smallness actually changed their whole body. It actually gave them superpowers. It altered their jaws, first of all, and it freed up the bones at the back of the jaw to become part of the ear. And this gave them extra sensitive hearing. And as a result, we now have, for example, bats and dolphins that can echolocate, or whales and elephants which can hear really, really low frequencies. Their whiskers and their fur made them extra sensitive to touch, so they could feel their way in the dark. And their sense of smell also became heightened. Mammals are actually the smelliest of animals, and they use scent to communicate and to mark their territory. So being small at the end of the Triassic, it basically made mammals into the animals that we know today. And very soon in the Jurassic and into the Cretaceous, they began to increase in size and explore new diets and new habitats alongside the dinosaurs. So looking at the fossil record, we very quickly start to see mole-like animals that were specialized for digging. We see semi-aquatic animals with flattened tails and webbed feet that, like otters or beavers. And we even see gliding mammals. So mammals in the Jurassic and Cretaceous were almost as diverse as mammals of the same size today. And it's true that none of them grew much larger than maybe a badger, but some of them were also meat-eating mammals. And we know that they were eating baby dinosaurs because we found fossils that have the bones of baby dinosaurs inside their stomach. Now, Liam mentioned at the start there that there might also be a little bit of Yorkshire in my talk. And sure enough, you may have heard recently that my co-author, Mike Romano, and I published on this fossil footprint, which we found in Burniston Bay, just north of Scarborough. We called it the enigmatic Burniston Track, and it came from the long nab member of the Scalby Formation, which is Middle Jurassic in age. Now, we don't know for sure what animal made this footprint. But one thing that we discussed was the possibility that it might have been made by a large mammal relative, something that we don't yet know in the fossil record from the Middle Jurassic in the UK. We don't know for sure. It could have been made by a reptile instead, but it's kind of an intriguing possibility because we now know that mammals in the time of dinosaurs were much more diverse and much larger than we previously thought possible. So we return again to that fateful day, 66 million years ago. The end Cretaceous mass extinction. It's also called the KPG, and it is of course famous for wiping out the non-bird dinosaurs. Birds, which are dinosaurs, they survived, as did some of the mammals. And we all love this story, of course, and we get these dramatic Hollywood apocalyptic sort of descriptions of the asteroid impact. But I want instead for a moment to make you think about it from the mammal's point of view. Imagine that you're a small burrowing mammal living at the end of the Cretaceous. To you, safe from the forest fires and the falling ash, the asteroid impact might have been nothing more than a strange rumble from the other side of the planet. And an animal like this can eat almost anything, including it could eat bits of the millions of dead animals that were littering the planet above, or perhaps the fungus that was growing amongst them and the insects. And of course, terrible climate disasters don't really matter if you live underground because burrows have their own climate control. And if you're warm-blooded and you have a body covering of fur, maybe a nuclear winter isn't as difficult to survive. And especially if you can feed your young on milk, that means as long as you can scrape enough food to feed yourself, you can still raise your young and multiply. So many mammal groups did die out alongside the giant reptiles, but enough of them survived in the aftermath. And it was this time around, it was them that grew to much larger sizes. And they became giant herbivores and carnivores and tree climbers, just like their ancestors did over 252 million years ago. So although the end Cretaceous is the most famous extinction event, as you heard earlier in this talk, it wasn't the largest. Now this graph, it shows extinction levels rising and falling through time. And extinction, we do think of it as a bad thing, but looking at the grand scheme of life on Earth, extinction is just the flip side of life. New groups are evolving and prospering all the time, and others are becoming extinct. And on average, we know that a species exists for around about a few million years before it disappears or is replaced by its descendants. But if you look at this graph, you can see that there are times when extinction levels rise really sharply and really high. And these are our mass extinction events. Now, 5 of them are known as the Big Five, because they were the first ones identified by the scientists that used mathematical analysis to look at fossils and extinction through deep time, through geological time. And the end Cretaceous, it used to be thought of as the most recent mass extinction, but of course we now know that we're in the middle of a new one, and that is the 6th mass extinction, which has been caused by our climate crisis. So I told you earlier that at the end of the Permian, the eruption of enormous amounts of lava on the Earth's surface had released carbon dioxide, CO2, into our atmosphere. So the CO2 levels rose to over 2,000 parts per million. So that's the highest ever seen in the history of life on Earth. Now, it's true that when you take a really long look at CO2 levels, they do fluctuate through time, but they usually rise and fall relatively steadily, and they don't tend to go outside of a certain range at any one time. So that gives plants and animals time to adapt as the changes occur to the atmosphere and the oceans around them. But over the last million years, although we've had ice ages and hothouses, our planet's CO2 levels haven't really risen above 300 parts per million. So they fluctuated, but they've stayed more or less below that. However, as I'm sure you know, in the last century, since we began burning fossil fuels, CO2 levels have skyrocketed. They're currently at around about 414 parts per million, and they're still rising. Now we know that this leads to similar effects to the end of the Permian. We get global rises in temperature, disrupting climate around the world. We get acidifying oceans. Our habitats begin to change, forest fires, drought. And I think the useful thing about the fossil record and studying extinct life is that it helps us learn the lessons that we need to apply to the present and to make predictions about the future. So what can our knowledge of extinction events in the past teach us about the effects of our climate crisis on mammals and other animals that are alive today? Well, one of the biggest problems that animals are going to face is extreme heat and lack of water. So in the hotter parts of the world, we know that animals often come out just at night when it's much cooler, like this Grasshopper Mouse, which is the star of an episode of BBC One's Hidden Kingdoms. If you haven't seen it, highly recommend it. And studies show that as our climate heats, even animals that used to move around in the daytime are starting to come out more often at dawn or dusk or at night. And that, of course, is because it's cooler and they save energy and water. And we might see in the coming decades, this trend continues for mammals and other animals. And of course, as you heard earlier, most mammals inherited good nighttime vision, thanks to their tiny nocturnal ancestors in the Triassic, so they have that advantage. I should say, of course, that humans, we are one of the few mammals that don't have good night vision. Many primates lost their night vision in exchange for the ability to see colour. Now, you might think animal populations, if they find their climate is heating up or changing in other ways, why don't they just move? You know, they could move towards the poles, or they could go up mountains to stay cool as the world heats up. Now, it's true that we're starting to see an increase in animals that are moving, seemingly moving poleward. However, it turns out in closer examination that, of course, they can't choose where they're going to live. They actually wander quite randomly. So I'll give you an example that we know from the more recent fossil record. During the ice ages, there were Arctic foxes living in the frozen tundra all across Europe, right the way to the south of Europe. And these are cold weather specialists. They have adaptations like thick fur, small ears. They're perfectly evolved for living in a freezing environment. So around about 11,000 years ago, when the last ice age had ended, the ice began to retreat northwards. And it looked like, at first glance, when we found bones from Arctic foxes across Europe, but as the ice retreated, it seemed like the Arctic foxes also retreated north and they followed the ice. However, scientists studied the DNA of these Arctic fox remains, and they realized that looking at the DNA, that actually the Arctic foxes didn't follow the ice at all. The ones that lived in the south of Europe, they just died out. It was only the ones in the north that already lived in the north that survived. And that's because, of course, animals don't know that they need to move to survive. They can't forward plan. And even if they did, even if they wanted to move, humans have now created barriers that prevent them from doing so. So our roads, cities, fences, other built structures, they make these uncrossable barriers that animals just simply can't get around. And in many parts of the world, it also brings wildlife into conflict with humans, and humans usually win such conflicts. I think one of the most obvious things we can learn from the fossil record is that it's really good to be small, especially in the long term. So we have around 5,500 mammal species on Earth today, and 90% of them are small rodents, like rats and mice. So we might think of, when you think of a mammal, you might think of a big cat or an elephant, but actually those bigger mammals are much less common. And we see that during mass extinction events, the largest animals are the ones that suffer the heaviest losses. And it's because they need more food and they need more habitat to survive. So when the climate changes, they're more likely to die from overheating as well and lack of water. So as our world heats up and the climate becomes extreme, we can expect that the survivors are going to be quite small. And of course, those that can adapt to living alongside humans and scavenging from our waste, in other words, those that are not fussy, and we also call them generalists, they do really well. They say that we're never more than a few meters from a rat, And rats are actually among the world's greatest success stories for mammals in the last few hundred years. But our world's wildlife in general is not faring well, as I'm sure you all know, and the rate of extinction taking place at the moment is well above the background rate, the average. I apologise, for some reason my background rate has slid away down there. It's meant to be, it's meant to be in the same line as here. You can see it at the bottom of the graph. So this graph clearly shows how the rate of extinction among backboned animals has risen really sharply in the last few hundred years, and it shows no sign of slowing. You know, this is the 6th mass extinction event that we're currently in today, and around 60% of all the mammals that are alive on Earth today are livestock: sheep, cows, pigs, goats. Then there's humans, 7 billion of us, that makes up another 36%, and just 4% are wild mammals. Think about that for a moment. 4% of the mammals on our planet are wild mammals. It's quite a stark picture. It's a staggering situation, and it can seem a bit bleak, and it is worrying. This is why our climate crisis is a crisis, just like the end of the Permian. And it's one of the greatest issues that faces humankind. But if there's something comforting that I find about looking at fossils, it's that although we know that 99.99999% of all the animals that have ever lived are now extinct, we are still here to tell the tale, to study these things. Unlike the animals that came before us, we can learn from the past, not just from our own mistakes, but also from the patterns of extinction and recovery that we see in the fossil record. So, in conclusion, I would say that mammal evolution, first of all, well, I hope that I've proven to you that it's much more varied and much longer than you might have thought. We can actually trace our lineage back 320 million years to the egg-laying tetrapods. And we can also see these patterns of recovery and extinction and recovery and extinction, and different animal groups, sometimes mammals, sometimes reptiles, maybe next time amphibians. They take turns in these cycles of becoming the largest and occupying different habitats and different diets. We can also learn what happens when the climate changes too quickly, and from that we can learn how to try and prevent that from happening on our planet today. And I think also we can see that some of that life, some life of some kind always survives. Otherwise we wouldn't be here. So maybe in the future, it's these small survivors that are going to go on and thrive when conditions improve. Will humans make it through? Well, I think that's up to us, isn't it? I'll leave you with this picture from the IUCN, which is talking about the societal challenges that we have in the face of climate change. And I know it seems like a bleak picture that I paint, but I actually think that it's very reassuring to know that life does tend to find a way, and that if we can turn things around fast enough, I have no doubt that the world can recover, just like it did at the end of the Permian. Thank you so much for listening to my talk, and to everybody here, and especially to April Neander for allowing me to use her beautiful illustrations throughout this talk. If you have any questions, I'd love to answer them if I can.
Thanks so much, Elsa. That was fascinating, and yeah, lots of things that I hadn't thought about or didn't know about. And you know, I'm a paleontologist. I'm supposed to know quite a lot about the subject, but there's all manner of things that you've highlighted. I didn't know that was the case. Or I like the idea of tiny midnight ninjas. That's a particularly appealing idea. So yeah, if people have questions, feel free to post them in the chat. I guess, as I can't see a question in the chat yet, I will ask a question, and maybe that will give a bit of time for people to think of other things they want to ask. How important, based on the paper you've just written with Mike Romano, how important do you think that sort of footprint fossil record might be or is for understanding mammal evolution? Because you've got, as you say, a hint of something possibly mammalian. Obviously, you say it's difficult to be sure, but here in Scarborough, we don't, as far as I know, have any mammal fossils in the middle Jurassic rocks, but you do find mammal fossils elsewhere. But we obviously have lots of footprints into the rocks. So is that something that we know tells us about mammal evolution, or could do? Is that something you sort of looked at further? Or
Yeah, footprints are really interesting. Sometimes you can get fossil footprints when you don't actually get fossil bones. So they can be really, really useful to tell us about, what lived where. But I think the thing that's really cool about footprints and other what they call trace fossils is that they can tell us about behavior, which of course, if you just have bones, you can reconstruct a skeleton, you might be able to put some flesh in it and think about what it looked like, but you don't know how it moved. So I think certainly if we could find more mammal tracks, there have been some found in different parts of the world, we'll be able to tell more about how they actually moved and behaved. So there are some really cool ones, for example, in South America that show that some types of mammals in the time of dinosaurs were hopping. And I think that's really cool because, we assumed, but we didn't really know, and you can actually see them hopping along. And some of them also look like they may have had young on their back, which made them hop slightly differently. So you can start to see behaviors and see things about their lives. So definitely footprints are always worth finding. They definitely give us good information about the past.
Well, it's also funny that we were, as part of the Fossil Festival today, we had a dinosaur footprint hunt in Scarborough, and there is a Facebook version you can go and look at if you kind of want to see what we were up to. But one of the things I flagged was that you highlighted when you published your paper that block that you found with the footprint in isn't there any longer, and actually we need pairs of eyes who are kind of aware that there are other footprints, and so that the enigmatic Burniston track you've described hopefully has other examples.
I really, really hope so. I would love it if people could keep an eye out. Of course, we all know what a dinosaur footprint looks like, but it's funny. Even myself, I know what I'm looking for if it's something, what we would say a tetrapod, something with 4 limbs, but I don't necessarily know how to recognize. We also get insect tracks, for example, and also you can get the fossils of rain imprints and things like that tell us all this kind of crazy stuff. So I think, yeah, you're absolutely right. The advice to anybody is if you see strange patterns in rocks, it's always better to be safe than sorry and take a photo, send it to an expert, just ask the question. Particularly your local museums are really great resources for that. You can send them pictures, but keep an eye on where you found whatever you found, of course, because there's nothing worse than when you can't find it again.
Yeah, we've got hopefully a new website going live very soon. It's called yorkshirecoast.rocks, and one of the points is that how do people know how to record things that they've discovered, and we're trying to sort of make that point that it's really, really important to tell us exactly, or as exactly as you can, where it came from. So another question I had was just, we've been doing Yorkshire's favourite fossil over the Twitter account of the festival for the last week or so. And I was thinking, in terms of the mammal fossils that you have encountered, do you have such thing as a favourite, or are they all just so interesting that you can't choose that way?
Oh, I find that sort of thing very difficult, because also my favourites change every year. When I find something else, it's my new favourite. I think taking the broader definition of what a mammal is and looking, like I did in my book, and looking much further back in time, I actually did some field work in South Africa. Found some of those more ancient mammal ancestors that lived in the Triassic alongside the dinosaurs. Yeah, I helped find some of those, and I think at the moment that's some of my favourite fossils that I found. But I'll probably change my mind next week.
Yeah, I also think it's an unfair kind of question, because people ask me and I'm like, yeah, last week it was this, and now I've changed my mind. So yeah, it was just a slightly unfair thing to ask. Okay, we have a question in the chat from Caroline Lomas. Says, did dolphins evolve from the sea or land, then back to the sea? So yeah, evolved from the sea. So kind of that mammalian evolution is interesting aquatic aspects. Do you have anything you can tell us on that side of things?
Yeah, I mean, animals from the land going back into the sea is a really, really interesting topic. So whales and dolphins came from a land-based ancestor that did go back to the sea. But they weren't, of course, the first ones to do it. Back in the time of dinosaurs, we've got marine reptiles that did exactly the same thing, and lots of other groups have done it. So over the course of evolution, you see this same thing happening in different groups. The same with flight. You get the first insects fly, then you get, pterosaurs, the first vertebrates to fly, then bats and birds. So yeah, dolphins, they come from, actually, they're more closely related to the hoofed animals, weirdly enough. It seems kind of counterintuitive, but it's thought that they were basically spending more and more time in the water, feeding on aquatic life. And of course, they just became better and better adapted to be in the water until eventually they thought, hey, you know what, we don't need to go back to land at all. And they developed all these amazing adaptations to be completely marine, completely aquatic. So yeah, they do come from a land-based ancestor. Although if you take the really long view, obviously all of us come from fish. So we kind of came from the water to the land, and then we were basically going back to the water again.
Yes, that's it. It's just a matter of choosing your duration of analysis and whether. Exactly. Yeah, fabulous. Next question, Anna Kirk-Smith asks, your optimism and pragmatism around extinction and species recovery is a marvelous outlook, although it's obviously optimal to avoid the sixth mass extinction. How do you feel that the current public debate is being handled?
It's an interesting question. I'm not sure exactly what part of it you're meaning, but I mean, it's a very difficult thing to talk about, isn't it? Because it is quite upsetting and depressing. And so quite often, you know, the sort of reaction that we feel in our gut is very, very overwhelming. What can we possibly do as individuals? I am quite pragmatic about the long term. As somebody who looks at the fossil record, obviously, I've got this kind of like, you know, what's 66 million years between friends, you know, we'll be fine. It might not be humans that go forward, but something will survive. But of course, that's not really useful to us in the immediate term. So I think there's two sides of it for me. And my pragmatism is that I am comforted by the knowledge that life does always persist. But that doesn't mean that I think it's okay that we lose the incredible diversity that we have. So in terms of like the current public debate, I mean, I think really most people are kind of on the same page that we want to do something about it. But doing something about it is, of course, so complex and difficult. We're feeling our way through, but I am optimistic. I think most people really do want to make a change and that we're figuring out what to do. I just hope that we can do it before we lose a lot of the diversity that we have. It feels sad that, you know, the planet goes on churning out these amazing species, and I really hate the thought that we're going to lose some of that diversity. So yeah, I'm hopeful, but yeah, worried, definitely worried.
Yeah, thanks for that. And actually, I think one of the things also struck me during your talk was how elegantly you demonstrate the value of paleontology. I think it's often quite easy to imagine it's a sort of an academic subject people do, and it doesn't really have any application. And actually, you know, what you're talking about is that sense of, well, if we look at what's happened in the past, it can help us understand what might happen in the future. We of course don't know exactly, but you get that more informed position, and yeah, maybe it helps us actually think about the way impacts are affecting particular groups or might affect particular groups, and perhaps feed into how we look at, you know, what we're doing. So yeah, I think that's a really key thing to be pushing.
And I think touching on that question as well, when it comes to putting things in context, you know, because you do, of course, get people who say, oh, well, the climate's always changed. But when you actually have that deeper perspective, you realize that, you know, what the normal sort of rate of change is and how much it really normally fluctuates right up until humans. And then basically the speed that things are changing, the way things are changing is not natural. It's not within that range of normal fluctuation. So it gives us context and it helps us realize that it's really not okay and that we really do have to do something about it.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Okay, so if there aren't any more questions, I'm sure we could sit and chat for quite a while, but I'm not sure that's what the audience are here for. So I guess I'll say thank you for such a fascinating and illuminating talk. I'm really looking forward to reading Beasts Before Us and seeing all the ways in which people elsewhere are reading it. And then yeah, just to flag that when after the festival we'll make Elsa's talk available online, and as Elsa talked quite a lot about, you know, extinction and recovery and evolution, other talks within the festival have also sort of picked up on that theme, so that you'll hopefully, if you haven't seen all of them, you'll be able to look at other lectures within the weekend and you know, broaden that discussion and that analysis. But yes, fabulous way to finish the Fossil Festival, and yeah, thanks so much for talking to us.
Thank you very much for inviting me. It was a pleasure.